In your life, you deserve to be more, do more, have more, and give more. And now the Becoming More podcast with Dianna Kokoszka.
So welcome to Becoming More with Alex Harris. Alex, I'm so glad that you're here today. And I love that last line on your bio where you said you were put on this earth to change the way you react the instant you hear the word impossible. Now, we all hear that word from time to time, yet you hear it a little bit different than all of us. Let's dive right in. And what happens to you when you hear that word impossible?
Well, something tickles me deep inside, and I kind of get fired up because it hints at a problem that is just begging to be solved, or maybe a challenge that needs to be looked at in a new way. So, yeah, I really do get tickled pink when I hear that, because it's just, it's kind of one of the ways I'm wired.
Well, you're a sports psychologist and you do many, many things. Yet you've used that word impossible in your own life. Let's delve into some of the things that you have done. You've climbed the 7 highest mountains on 7 continents. What was that like?
Really long, 15 years, and it required an enormous amount of patience and an enormous amount of convincing that, they're not right, although a lot of times you think that everyone is right. For a long time, I was reminded I came from a city where there are mine dumps and buildings, Johannesburg in South Africa, but no mountains. So how can someone from that background think about climbing the world's highest mountains? And a lot of frustration in that journey, but I think that's the part of these big challenges. They're not a plain straight road. They're the Himalayas. They're ups and downs, and finally, if you're lucky, you get to stand on top.
Okay, so you are on pretty much a flat land. When was that dream put in your heart to climb these mountains?
I am asked that many times, and I'm not sure that there's ever a specific moment. Maybe some people do have an epiphany and just feel overwhelmingly called in a new direction. But mine was more a kind of a journey filled with stepping stones. And it started out rock climbing in our sort of local mountain range, about an hour out of the city. And that led to some higher mountains about 3 hours out of the city. And that led to Kilimanjaro. And Kilimanjaro is one of the 7 summits. And slowly they became harder and higher and more logistically complex. And I guess as part of that journey, the self-talk narrative increases as well. Well, you know what? Maybe this is something I can do. And then you start aligning with like-minded, crazy people. And before you know it, you've got a bit of momentum.
Well, yeah, who you hang out with really does matter, that's for certain. I want to go to Mount Everest. Did you just climb it the first time, or was it multiple times?
No, so I only actually made it to the very top on our 3rd attempt. The first time we spent 52 days on the mountain with no summit. The second time we spent 65 days on the mountain with no summit. And then on the 3rd time, we got to the summit on day 70 on the mountain. So that's a whole bunch of time in a small little tent waiting for, an hour of hopefully clear weather and a little bit of glory.
So you were there for days waiting in a tent to get to the summit and never made it because of weather. Is that correct?
Yes, both times. The challenge is you're there for so long, your body has to adapt, and that process of adaptation to the death zone takes weeks, a couple of months. Once you're adapted, you then need to wait for a very small weather window between these big pressure systems, and you have to be in the right place at the right time, adapted and ready. And there really is a whole lot of luck involved in getting to the top of Everest. What makes luck possible is the preparation and the experience. That will get you in the position to be able to maybe enjoy some good luck the following day on summit day. But if that next day the weather's bad, it doesn't matter how prepared you are, how strong you are, you're not going to make it to the top.
Well, what I love about this, and I'm so excited to hear about it, is because it's kind of like our goals. Sometimes
Yeah.
we look at those that they are so big, yet we don't do that preparation to get us to where we can obtain the goal. How long did it take you to prepare for Mount Everest before you even stepped foot on the mountain?
I mean, I could answer that specifically and say the 6 months of prep for that final challenge. But the reality is it was the 9 years before from the very first Everest expedition. And it was probably the 6 years before that, climbing the other 7 summits, learning about altitude, learning about adaptation, about how the physiology of a human being works at high altitude in the death zone. And so really that's saying there was 15 years of preparation that went into that.
Yeah, so you just didn't go do that. And most people understand that part of it. So all these 7 mountains, and you've climbed them, and each one prepared you for the next. And then you decide to, I've had enough of the cold, let's cross a desert that no one else has crossed. How did you prepare for that, from going to the heights of glory so much to the depths of a desert?
Well, the desert, so the mechanical difference is that instead of climbing up, you're moving forward constantly and you have to carry a bunch of weight. So we had to design a cart that we could pull, similar to the sled that we pulled walking to the South Pole. And the way you train for that in the verdant suburbs of Johannesburg is you pull a car tire up and down the road with a sling, and that develops the right kind of muscles. But really the key was trying to design a cart that could carry enough food and supplies and water to make it to 3 oases and give us a chance to survive a journey of about 40 days. And it was very different to Everest. Everest, we had lots of support. In fact, the entire expedition on High Mountain is supported. On a desert expedition where you're ostensibly unsupported, you have to be completely self-dependent, and you have to make sure your system has enough redundancy that if there are small failures, and there were, you still have a chance of making it and, of course, surviving.
Well, I know one of my models in my book is that you learn, you implement, you fail, and you relearn a new way. There were only 2 of you going across that desert, and aren't you the only 2 that have crossed that desert ever?
So there were actually 3 of us, and as far as we know, yeah, we're still the only 3 to have done it completely unsupported and unassisted. There've been a handful of people that have used the Bedu tribes and camels to guide them across. There was a British team of 2 that followed a similar route with a similar type of cart, but they used support along the way. So they ate food that was given to them by small villages. But in terms of being completely unsupported, I don't think anyone else has tried since we crossed it. So yeah, it's just the 3 of us, but that part of the world, it's always politically sensitive. So it's not like there's thousands of people flocking for a 40-day pilgrimage across the desert.
How many people said you were crazy?
Everyone. Well, I'll tell you specifically how that seed was sown. I was sitting on Everest, and that expedition in 2005 was with Sir Ranulph Fiennes, whom the Guinness Book of Records calls the greatest living explorer. He had spent some time in Oman with the British SAS, and I asked him one day, playing cards on Everest in a period of quiet, what's never been done by anyone, because I was intrigued by that problem. Most of the mountaineering problems are done. And he put his cards down, he lifted up his head, he looked across, he smiled, and he said, Alex, cross the empty quarter, the Rub al Khali, unsupported. I'll be your patron, but I won't come with you because you're going to die. It's impossible. And that moment was where the seed was sown. There was a little spark, but a lot had to unfold. We still had to finish the 7 summits. We still had to walk to the South Pole. But fast forward years down the line, and all of that's been done. And enough has shifted in my mind around this construct of what's possible. And so that little seed was starting to grow into something tangible.
Okay, so we're going to get to the South Pole in a minute, yet you're sitting there with somebody that says, hey, do this, and you're going to die.
Yeah.
And yet inside your brain, you're going, I want to do it. I got to figure this out. What is that? Did you want to do something that no one else had done? Didn't that frighten you, where a gentleman that had so much experience was telling you you were going to die?
I suppose some of it has to do with what I kind of term the prison of ambition, this idea that we just want to do more and more and more and more. But that's a real small part of it. It was enormously appealing that the greatest living explorer, a man who held multiple records, polar records, was saying something was impossible. It intrigued me that he thought it was impossible. And so I didn't differentiate. If anyone says to me something's impossible, the word is what fires me up to look at the problem differently, not who's saying it. But the fact that this was Rand Fine saying it definitely came with a little bit. I mean, I remember sitting down thinking, okay, I first need to answer for myself whether this journey is actually possible before I commit this team and convince them that it's possible. And so the first question I had to answer was, why does a man like Rand Fine, with all his experience, think this is impossible? And that was the starting point.
So it started with the question is why this person thought it was impossible. And then what could you do to actually accomplish it? Were you out to prove him wrong, or just to prove that you could do something that no one else could do?
Yes, it was more to do something that no one else had done and to understand the challenges that came with that, where there was no precedent. Remember, when we climbed Everest, I wasn't the first South African. I think I was the third South African to climb Everest, and the second to climb the seven summits. When I walked to the South Pole, we were the first Africans to do that, but there had certainly been a handful of British explorers, Scandinavian explorers, some US explorers. So it did intrigue me, was there somewhere a problem in the adventure exploration space that had never been done? And most of the polar and mountain problems have been solved. Most of the ocean stuff, if you want to go and do something in mountains that's never been done, it's going to be really contrived and really dangerous. And I didn't want to contrive something. And so the deserts was a opportunity. And because Rand had spent 3 years there and had explored the empty quarter to a degree, it was enormously appealing. And of course, there was no chance of getting frostbite. And that for me was just super exciting, because I didn't like the cold by the time I was finished with the South Pole.
Well, you did a lot of things before you crossed the desert. Yet before I leave there were 3 oases. Is that correct? Along where did you know that there was actually water there, or would be water? Or did you just hope for water?
No, so, when you start this journey, you have to define the ethics. So if you're going to do it unsupported, what does that mean? Well, it means being relatively self-sufficient. And so we wanted to follow the footsteps of Wilfred Thesiger, who was a famous British explorer that crossed the Arabian desert in the company of some Bedou back in the 40s. And he wrote an enormously compelling book on the story called Arabian Sands, which is just, it's just an incredible, it's a classic read. And of course, in the 40s, there were no sovereign nations on the Arabian Peninsula. The land was divided by tribes. So Saudi Arabia didn't exist, Oman didn't exist, and the Emirates didn't exist. Today, of course, you have borders. And so we wanted to largely follow his route. And he stopped at 3 oases and filled up on about a 700-mile journey. He filled up roughly every sort of 200 miles 3 times. And we actually went on two occasions, the 2 years prior, to check one of them. And we knew the other one, maybe the water wasn't good, but there was a small village. And the third one was very close to an army base. So our concession was that we're going to try and get to those points. Similar to our journey across Antarctica, we didn't carry water with us because every night we chopped some ice and melted the ice. So that was a natural part of the journey. The desert was a little bit different. There wasn't water everywhere. And so we knew in our planning, we have to carry around 200 liters, for 3 of us to last about 2 weeks to get to each of these 3 places where we could refill. That was the primary difficulty of designing a cart that could weigh 400, almost 1,000 pounds, with the food that wouldn't break, and to pull it across soft sand. So it wasn't just a thumb suck. It was, but one problem, Thesiger, his line took him actually into the sovereign nation of Saudi Arabia today. We couldn't get permission to enter Saudi Arabia after 3 years of trying and pleading. And what that meant was we had to follow a line along the Saudi Arabian border in Oman, further north and slightly east, and add about 200 kilometers to our journey. So our journey was actually a little bit further than Thesiger's journey, but still with the goal of ending up at Dubai and, the Trucial coast, starting in Salalah on the Arabian Sea in southern Oman.
Visiting one of the deserts close to Saudi Arabia as well as Dubai, when I walked along, I mean, my feet went way down into the sand. And here you are walking how many days in that sand? What did you do? Did you have any type of special shoe or anything that you had designed that would help you?
No, and we spent a long time deliberating on the foot story. The Bedou, certainly 100 years ago, were mostly barefoot. And we didn't go that route because, one, we didn't grow up in a rural area where we were barefoot with hardened foot pads. We've grown up in a city like a normal kid. And so we knew from the outset, barefoot's not an option. And so we really went for a sort of trail running shoe that was most comfortable. And we didn't pay too much attention to the soft sand. And the reason for that is, if you look at the Arabian Peninsula on Google Earth or sort of, a space view, you'll see that the sand dunes cover it like a maze. But within the sand dunes are what the Arabs call sabka, and sabka is like a small little flat pan, and it's made of mineralized kind of sand, so it's quite hard. And our experience in the 2 years building up to it, first going to the Emirates and spending a week and walking about 70, 80 miles, then going to Oman the following year and spending 2 weeks and walking about 100 miles, we very quickly realized the goal really is to stay away from the big dunes and stay on the sabka. And so thread like a piece of string through these pearls, try and walk from sabka to sabka. Of course, over 40 days, we crossed many little necks, and there were plenty of times when we were on soft sand and it was absolutely desperate. But the goal was always to try and thread through. And so we printed out almost 90 A3 images taken from Google Earth. And we would literally on a day-to-day basis start our day and visually align ourselves with the image in front of us and what we saw ahead of us, and try and piece together the best way. And I think specifically, it's why Rand Fine said this is impossible, because in his time, he wouldn't have had the luxury of Google Earth. And so all he was confronted was just a wall of 700 miles of sand dunes and a maze, not knowing which way to turn. And we had that benefit. But it was still, I mean, there were days when we made mistakes, when what appeared to be an easy neck got us into trouble, and we spent half the day unpacking the sled, carrying all the cart, carrying all our water and everything over this neck, and then piling it back on. So it was not an easy task, It was, I mean, it was a complex and it was a stressful expedition for probably 5.5, 6 weeks of the total time.
Some people may be wondering, why did she ask about the shoes? I asked because every little thing that had to be taken care of, you thought it through. You explored it, you did research. And I know with your intelligence, you looked at every little thing. Now, leading up to the desert, you had another feat that you had completed. And I think it helped you by crossing the Antarctica. You did this in 65 days, the 65 degrees below zero,
Yes.
to prepare for the desert. I found that a little bit interesting, that you just keep going from one extreme to another here. Let's switch to the South Pole. You had a goal to plant your country's flag at the South Pole.
Yeah.
Where did that dream come from, and how did it come about?
So again, if we backtrack to Everest in 2005 with Rand Fines, I think one of the luxuries of being in the presence of someone like that for 70 days, and that's how long we were sitting on Everest, actually 75 days. And, you know, what people don't realize is in those 70 days, you're physically climbing maybe 14, 15 days. The rest of the time, you're actually sitting and you're resting and you're recovering and you're waiting for the weather. And so in all of that time, it's a very social place. You spend a lot of time in close proximity, intimately getting to know people, reading books, as I mentioned, playing cards. It was in that time that I got to know Rand Fines. I had read several of his books before the expedition, you know, especially Mind Over Matter, his famous book around the first unsupported crossing of Antarctica. And so, you know, we gleaned a lot of information, and there was the thought of maybe going to the South Pole, but it was the presence of Rand that encouraged us and confirmed that we had the right aptitude. Our attitude was great, and our willingness to learn and be humble and absorb information put us in a place where he believed we could do this. So, you know, from the outset, when that expedition had finally finished and we climbed the 7, the sort of seeds that had been sown were ones of belief and encouragement, and this was from the greatest living explorer. And so then we began to unpack, how do we walk to the South Pole? We've never skied before, but actually you need to ski. It's not walking, you need to ski. You need to learn to ski. And so Rand stayed a mentor. We had a guy also in Norway that mentored us. And that journey began really from the start, where we acknowledged we don't know how to ski. Let's learn how to ski and see if we can do 11 miles a day. We've got a chance of making it in 60 days.
Okay, now going there, you said, what are we going to eat that will give us the protein that we need? And so now you're on this journey, watching every little detail. And what you came up with was olive oil. How did you determine that? And how much did you have to take? And how did you train yourself to drink that every single day for 65 days?
Yes. So look, the great need is not so much protein, it's more calories. And historically, so the challenge is that we've decided to do this unsupported. So no one is, you know, we're not allowed to have suppliers laid en route for us, which would obviously make it easier, because then you can have a smoked turkey every 10 miles waiting for you and a bottle of champagne, you know. If you're carrying everything yourself, systemically you're limited because there's only so much weight you can pull. And so that means you're carrying an enormous amount of weight, which has an enormous energy requirement. If you're pulling that for 10 hours a day, you cannot make up that energy requirement in the food you carry because of the weight limitation. And so there's a deficit. And historically, how explorers have overcome that deficit is either a olive oil, a plant type based oil, or ghee butter, which is like a very rich Indian type of butter. The reason we didn't go with the butter is because we couldn't find it locally in South Africa to adapt ourselves. And so we chose the olive oil because we knew we could find olive oil in South America quite easily. And the calorie content is relatively the same. But, and you know, interestingly, there were mixed opinions amongst some of the professional nutritionists that we consulted as to whether or not we would be able to metabolize that amount of fat in the oil. And the consensus was leaning towards no, we won't be able to. But we started about 2 months before with a tablespoon of olive oil, and every week we upped it by a tablespoon. And literally every night in the kitchen, I'd walk in there and I'd swallow a tablespoon. Now that ain't half bad. I mean, you throw that on your, on your salad every evening anyway. But after a month, it's now, it's a small little cup. After 2 months, it's 100 mils. It's, it's half a wine glass, and it's a different story. So it was just an awful experience. I mean, I remember Sibu, my partner on the journey, he had to have a very specific routine of little tricks and hacks to swallow his olive oil, or he would just throw it up. And he went through this routine every night. The last one, he actually even filmed on camera because it was a momentous occasion. There were 2 days, and how I can testify that we certainly metabolized that quantity. There were 2 occasions, somewhere around sort of the day 50 mark, when it came to the evening ritual, and I sat with this little bottle of olive oil. The minute I opened it up and I smelt it, it made me so sick. So nauseous. I could not drink it. I poured it out. And the next day, about 2 hours into the day, I became hyperglycemic, what athletes call bonking. I mean, I bonked like I've never bonked in my life. And I realized my body had become so dependent on those 824 kilocalories, almost 20% of my excess energy I had thrown away, and I paid the price for it. I struggled for 2-3 hours. I did it on one more occasion, but I knew, I'm gonna battle. So my body had become absolutely dependent on that small bottle of olive oil. It was crazy.
Well, so here you are. I want to go back a little bit. When you decide to do this, was it planting your country's flag, or that no one else had done this without support?
So there had been a handful of other nations that had done it unsupported. No African had done it unsupported. And, there was a tongue-in-cheek sort of argument that, look, we're from Africa. I mean, it never snows. You've never skied. You're going to die. I mean, you guys are crazy. And there was kind of this sort of rebellious thinking that, well, we'll show you. We're going to do it. We're going to be the first. But I don't think that's ever been the key motivator. The motivator for me is that I've been made in the image of God. I have in my DNA something that creates, something that makes, something that invents, something that bewilders, that imagines, and I don't know precisely how I've been made. I don't know the blueprint other than glimpses of it. And so my life has been partly an obsession of that blueprint. How has God made me? And that's an exciting thing. And so all of these challenges beg the question, is this possibly how God has made me? And there's only one way to answer that question. It's to go and do it, try and do it, and then you get a slight part of the picture. And over time, you get a clearer idea of how God's made you. And that's, I think, one of the most powerful revelations a human being can have.
Well, you definitely have purpose in your life and passion. And I want to take our audience through a little bit of what you did getting to the South Pole. It wasn't an easy trek. I mean, you had to cross so many miles each and every day, and you tracked that each and every day. What happened if you got behind?
Well, it's not like someone takes a whiteboard eraser and rubs it off the total. You have to make it up. And so we carried 60 days of normal rations. So we figured we could do, 20 kilometers a day. So the journey was 600 nautical miles roughly that we had to walk. And we broke that down into about 11 miles a day. So, sort of 60 days of normal food plus 7 emergency rations. And the emergency rations were pared down rations that allowed us to sit out an emergency, like a windstorm, a broken this or terrible weather. But and so when we worked out our daily average, it came down to that 20 kilometers a day. And we took about 3 weeks to do our first 20 kilometers a day, which sounds crazy. So from the word go, we were way behind the curveball. And it was the single biggest cause of this increasing mental stress that we're getting behind the curveball. In fact, it took us 40 days to get halfway. And I remember the night we had a celebration, I had marked our journey on the inside of our tent. And I started to think about the sums. And what was staring at me was a couple of simple facts. One was that it took 2/3 of our time to complete half our journey. We only had a third left of time, or a third of our resources, to do exactly the same amount that had taken us 2/3. And so no matter how you spin that, that sum adds up to a no-win scenario. So it was an enormously stressful time, but we kept plugging away. We knew that there were things working in our favor. That idea of process being compounded when you do certain things. So simple examples, we knew that the way our systems worked day to day, how we put up the tent, how we took it down, all of that would become more efficient. How we skied, our actual mechanics would become more efficient. And so that would compound our effectiveness and make our distances increase over time. But we had to remind ourselves of that fact. Another fact is that our sleds were getting lighter. We were consuming food every day. And so by the time we got halfway, our sleds were significantly lighter, and all of that would point to a more effective and a faster second half. But when the evidence is staring in your face to the contrary, you need to remind yourself of these principles and stick to them. Otherwise, you're doomed.
Well, you had to play mental games in each and every one of these feats, whether it's climbing a mountain, crossing the desert, or planting the flag for South Africa at the South Pole. You have to play mental games. Talk to us about some of the mental games that you played that may help us in our life.
Wow, now you're asking me the million-dollar question. So, I was with a degree in sports psychology. It wasn't helping me much. I was having to invent strategies, and most of them actually had to do with our perception of the passage of time. And here's the thing, we're all pretty smart. It's very difficult to lie to yourself. And so you can't lie to your brain and pretend you are covering more ground than you really are, because your brain's going to be onto you. But what you can do is alter the way you perceive the passage of time. And I'll share a couple of examples that might not sound that dramatic, but really laid the foundation for all of these little tricks. And so, so one of the things I would do is, by the time we got to halfway, it was taking us 6 days to cross a degree of latitude. So 60 nautical miles. And when I wake, so let's say we're at 85 degrees, we were walking from 80 degrees south to 90 degrees south, the South Pole. So let's say I wake up on the morning and we're at 85 degrees for the first time. I know 6 days from now, we're going to be at 86 degrees. But I'm so overwhelmed that the idea of 6 days from now is just too daunting. And so what I would say to myself is, okay, all I'm thinking about is after tomorrow. Because when I get to the tent after tomorrow, I'm going to be able to fall asleep, and I'm going to be able to wake up that next morning and say to myself, you know what? After tomorrow, I'm at 86. So I've just said exactly the same thing as 6 days from now, but after tomorrow doesn't sound that, and so you're playing all these little tricks. You're not changing the truth. You're just shifting how you perceive the truth. If, for example, we had 3 hours to go till sort of our break, and I was in just a terrible, stressful time of the day when I just didn't think we were going to make it. As we dropped into that last hour, I wouldn't say we've got an hour to go. I'd say I've got 59 minutes to go. 59 minutes sounds way more doable than an hour. So I'm just constantly manipulating the passage of time, because the longer the suffering, the longer the thing is that you're doing, the more mentally draining it is. In any endeavor, time is the biggest component that leads to mental stress. So anything you can do that allows you to bend or shift or shape time to suit you is a little trick. And then we had a whole lot of other sort of strategies on the sort of hourly basis, little tricks of counting, distracting, highlight reels. I would play highlight reels of all the meals, the best meals I've ever had in my life, who made them, where were they made. I would recreate them elaborately. I would eat and feast on these highlight meals, and then, hopefully an hour would be gone, but typically it was only 5 minutes.
Okay, so you're thinking about all this food, you're recreating it, imagining it in your mind, and then you get to drink the olive oil.
Yep.
It's hard for me to absolutely compute that in my mind. I would be wanting that turkey or that steak, or did you ever just crave those types of food?
All the time. All the time. I guess it took about maybe 2 weeks for our metabolism to shift over from the energy system and consume most of our readily available fat. So now we had cannibalized most of the fat, and in essence, we were now starving. So what we're putting in is less than what we're burning. And the moment that happened is when your mental focus shifts to food. You can't think of anything else but food. And, one of the treats during the day, we had a few sort of snacks during the day, but one of them was a packet that had about 15 M&Ms in, along with some nuts and stuff. I would keep the M&Ms. And at nighttime, after dinner, when we were in our sleeping bags trying to fall asleep, I would take an M&M and I would suck on it, and I would suck that chocolate off, and then I would eat the nut. We also had these coffee beans coated in chocolate. I would do the same thing. I'd pull them out of those bags in the day and save them for the evening. I would suck the chocolate off, and then I'd save the coffee beans, and the next day I'd chew on a coffee bean. So I would just stretch out all these little treats so that I had something to look forward to.
Well, when you planted your country's flag, what feelings did you have inside?
Sure. I guess the first one was relief, absolute relief that in fact, I remember unclipping from my sled and knowing this is the last time I'm unclipping from the sled. There were times when I felt like I was a prisoner to the sled, like the sled had taken the supernatural power, that it controlled me, that it forced me to do these things, that it held me captive. And finally getting there, I could unclip for the first time, and sorry, the last time. And so with that, the overwhelming sense was just relief, like we really felt like we were free. And there was a long time when I knew that we had placed ourselves in this prison. And so fundamentally, a life of doing these things had changed my nature to the point where failure was not an option. And the revelation that failure is not an option, that I cannot take out the satellite phone and call for a plane, had one overwhelming implication. The only way out is to get to the end. And so when you're finally at the end, we felt free, literally free. And I remember walking up some stairs into the US, the polar base at the South Pole, and there was a table with some cookies and sort of small little cakes, and they said we were allowed to have them. And yeah, I tell you what, we ate those cookies like they were like the feast for kings. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And of course it was, we didn't think too much about the pride of putting our flag there. That has come in the years since then. When I look at the video of us standing at the South Pole and some of the commentary and seeing our flag there, and I realize, how much it took to get that there, and that that will never change, like that moment is now set in time. And one day my kids will be able to see that video. And so the pride I feel for doing that has been very much a retrospective thing. It wasn't in the moment, it came after the time.
Well, I know you played tricks with your mind, you chunked down your goals. We've learned so much as we go back and listen to this over and over again. We will draw things for our businesses and for our lives. I do want to ask you a final question, though. You brought up the fact that humility was needed to gain all of these feats, to do all the things that you have done, and you're still very much a humble person. What have you done to stay in that humility and not allow your ego to take over now you're doing biking and other extreme sports, right?
So I think for me, the journey, my life has made me realize that God has made this whole world a temple. The temple is not the church that we go to on a Sunday. It's not a place where the cross is on the wall. It's everything that God has made. It's this world. And so as we move through that, I've learned to move with reverence. I've learned to stop and look at seemingly innocuous things and be moved by a small hill that has no beauty other than the fact that it was made by God to look and be like that hill. And so when you have that sense, then you realize you're connected to something infinitely bigger than you, but so is everyone else. And so I'm not more special than anyone else. I'm not, more. I guess all the difference is simply I've learned how to manage, how to move through some of the more harsher environments in this world. And that's the key difference. But when you have a sense that you live and move in this incredible temple where the manifest evidence of God is everywhere, his mercy, his might, and everyone carries that in their DNA, how can you not be humbled? For me, it's just it's a self-evident thing. And maybe that's because I've been to all these crazy places, and I've had intimate time with the Lord and asked him, why has he made this place? Why have you made Antarctica? Why is it minus 85? Why have you brought me here? So yeah, I mean, whether it's moving through the city or through the desert, it's a deeply moving place, the world. God has just created something special, and we carry that in us and with us.
Well, you are very much something special in our lives, and you've shared so much with us today. Tell us where we can reach you and what you are up to right now in today's world.
Well, it's very exciting. We have, so our family's in the process of immigrating to Texas from South Africa. And that was finally approved about 3 months ago. So, I've lived here for 53 years. And it's time that a family adventure is taking us across the big pond. But our business is an events business. So, we do these crazy mountain bike races called the Munga, and obviously we do some leadership and motivational speaking. But we want to take the brand to the US now. We think there's an enormous opportunity in the US, and I also think I'm not sure how, but I think we, as in my family and I and our brand, have some part to play in affecting the culture in the US, and specifically the demographic that I address, that my brand, our events and our learnings address. And so that I don't know how that's going to play out yet, but that's super exciting. So this time next year, I hope to be just around the corner from you in Dallas, which is going to be very exciting.
Well, and tell us do you have social media, website? How would they find you?
Well, you can go to themunga.com, the as in THE, and Munga is MUNGA.com. That's our main events business. And you can just pop me an email through that. And yeah, I mean, I'm available all the time. I've always felt that's one of the key things is to just be available. I think the minute you're no longer available, you sort of start putting yourself on a pedestal. And yeah, people want to ask questions. They want to know how cold and how warm and how hard is this thing and that thing. So yeah, I mean, I might not always answer my phone, but then it's my 4 kids that are dragging me away. But pop us a mail, and I'll always get back to that. So the Manga is the best place, and our Facebook page, the Manga as well. You can see our events. My wife says I need to promote myself a little bit more so that I can help everyone out there overcome their challenges, and I'm learning to do that. That's one of my challenges.
Well, it is because of that humility that you hold. It's not really self-promotion, it's caring and helping about each other. And you've helped every one of us today. I want to thank you so much. Each and every time I hear you speak, it just gets better and better. And I get to hear more and more of how the little things that you did to accomplish these great big things literally help us in our everyday life, in our business life, and in our leadership. And thank you so much, Alex. I know it's late there in South Africa. I appreciate you spending time with us today. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Thrilled to be with you. Thanks so much, Dianna.
In your life, you deserve to be more, do more, have more, and give more. And now the Becoming More podcast with Dianna Kokoszka.